profesor de neurociencia cognitiva en el Replicante College de la Universidad de Londres y ha sido director del Centro para la Neurociencia Educacional de la misma universidad. La réplica la hará Paola Hernández del Centro Lombardo Toledano y de la UAM Guajimalpa, y la charla de Michael se titula Fundamental Flaws in Psychology, How Neuroscience and Computational Approaches May Help. So, I'm for 5 minutes. Then Paola has 15 minutes for comments, and then we open the session for questions from the audience. So, it's a pleasure to have you here, Michael.
Thank you. Can you all hear me okay? Louder? Okay. So, first of all, many thanks for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here with you today. A couple of apologies as well. Normally when I give talks, I walk up and down and wave my arms a lot. So sitting here, I think it's going to be a different talk. I don't know how, but it's going to be different. And also when I sent in this title, I said I would do 2 fundamental flaws in psychology. But now I'm starting to think 2 that's a bit brave, particularly in 45 minutes. So instead, I'm probably going to do 1 fundamental flaw. So that's probably enough. But if I have time, I'll move on to a second fundamental flaw. Okay, so first of all, I'm talking about fundamental flaws, but I think most of you will think that psychology is in really good shape, and what are these flaws I'm talking about? You can go to the bookshop and get some excellent textbooks on psychology, and we have concepts such as perception and memory and attention and language, and it all seems fairly well grounded. Now, we don't exactly know how that corresponds to what goes on in the brain, but I'm sure we'll figure that out in time. We've got lots of excellent brain imaging techniques. So, what could these flaws be that I'm referring to? Okay, so up front, here are my 2 flaws. I'm going to claim that there has been insufficient influence of neuroscience on psychology, and I'm going to try and show what a greater influence would look like. And then I'm going to argue that variations in cognitive ability have been studied separately, mainly for very reasonable, pragmatic reasons, but this has led to some ongoing conceptual confusion, and perhaps that confusion is increasing as there's an emergence of more and more data from genetics, which is intrinsically based only on one form of variability, that's individual differences. Okay, so can there still be flaws in modern psychology? I thought a good place to start would be to go look at a textbook on psychology. I went to my nearby bookshop and bought the very most recent undergraduate textbook I could find, 2015. This is what modern psychology looks like. Okay, so we've got chapters on evolution, the brain, sensation and perception, consciousness, learning, memory, language and thinking, motivation and emotion, intelligence, physical and cognitive development, social and emotional development, personality, social thinking and behavior, health, psychology and adjustment, psychological disorders, treatment and disorders. There you go, that is modern psychology. So I want to make a few points about the state of modern psychology. Let's start at the top here. Comparatively, there's relatively small focus on evolution. That is the pressures of design that led to the construction of the cognitive system, and also the brain. And indeed, if in this particular chapter in this textbook, most of the information on the brain was structural. Different brain regions, things about neurons and axons, and then a bunch on how wonderful our modern imaging techniques work. But not a lot on how the brain works. Okay, so 1 point to note. Second point to note, this is again a relatively small amount of attention paid to motivation and emotion. Now, these are the goals that have been built by evolution into the design of the system, what it's for, what it should pursue, and the fact that very often within modern psychology, emotion is viewed as a sort of attentional distraction, things that get in the way of you solving problems and perceiving the world, and so forth. And again, I find that slightly unusual. There's a lot of that modern psychology that focuses on what one might call cognitive psychology, and there's a lot in there about representations and information processing. But what's slightly strange about that is there's very little mention of action and of motor behavior in there. And indeed, if you go through those chapters, very often you could be characterizing what's going on in a laptop sitting on a desk, with no body and no action. It's all just the computations inside. Finally, if you think about variability, that's split across quite a lot of disparate chapters. So there's a chapter on individual differences between people, a couple of chapters on development, which is a form of variability over age, and then 2 further chapters down here on variability when things look bad, how to intervene. Okay, so that's setting the stage of modern psychology. Let's start with the first floor. Let's see if I can get all the way through this before time runs out. So, I'm going to use a particular example drawn from an area where I'm doing research at the moment to try and illustrate the possibility that there may be some problems with current psychology. And that is the field of educational neuroscience. So, for the last few years, I've run a research centre in London called the Centre for Educational Neuroscience, which brings together expertise from several of the institutions in London, University College London, the Institute of Education, and Berkeley College, where I'm based. And indeed, we finally managed to put that expertise together and publish a book a year or 2 ago on educational neuroscience. So, what is this new field? Well, it's the idea that we want to add to what was already known about the learning sciences, the new findings coming from neuroscience about learning. So, the goal ultimately is to have educational improvements and is to try and produce translational research so that we translate what we understand about mechanisms of learning and biological factors such as diet, sleep, and stress, and understanding the origins of individual differences, for instance, from genetic or environmental sources, and try and leverage those new insights to improve the outcomes of education and the achievement of children in the classroom. So I should make clear that I, for a while, thought that learning was all there was to education. How naive I was being. It only took a bit of time of interacting with educationalists to figure out that learning apparently is only a small part of education. So this is a diagram I ended up producing that says learning may be at the center of education, but there are all sorts of factors about the administration and organization and social influences and links to the economy and training and policy and so forth. So education is a big field, but I would think at the heart of it is learning, and the more we understand about the mechanisms of learning, the more we can hopefully optimize the outcome of children's educational performance. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about a psychologist who is skeptical about educational neuroscience. So this is a psychologist called Dorothy Bishop, who's at the University of Oxford, and she writes a blog where she broadcasts her opinions on the state of the field, and it's quite an influential blog, occasionally referred to in the newspapers, particularly when Dorothy criticizes other researchers. And she said this about educational neuroscience. She said, as someone who works at the interface of child development and neuroscience, I've been struck by the relentless rise of the subdiscipline of educational neuroscience. But at the heart of this enterprise, there seems to be a massive disconnect. Neuroscientists can tell you which brain regions are most involved in particular cognitive activities and how this changes with age or with training. But these indicators of learning do not tell you how to achieve learning. Educators should be interacting with psychologists, not neuroscientists, although I'm all for basic cognitive neuroscience research. So obviously this is a bit of a challenge. I'm trying to direct a Centre of Education on Neuroscience. So Dorothy went further and gave a particular example. She imagined a scenario where, say, children are having problems learning to read. So you might give them a training task to improve their sort of phonological awareness, their ability to understand the words and make up speech sounds. And let's say you image their brain and look at brain activation. And then Dorothy imagined 4 possible scenarios. And they were that the brain is changed, and the reading is changed, the child's reading performance improves. The brain is unchanged, but reading is changed. The brain is changed, but reading is unchanged. And finally, that nothing changes. Okay. Now she said, so which of those conditions are of interest to the educator? Those 2 conditions. And in fact, from her perspective, it doesn't really matter if the brain changes or not, since the educators are just interested in the behavior. Okay, so from Dorothy's perspective, brain doesn't matter. So, a bit concerned about that. That wasn't my understanding of why we were doing neuroscience in the first place. I didn't think it was just about correlations. Really, my impression was that we were trying to use the data we get from brain function to improve cognitive theory. So instead, I imagined a different scenario. In my scenario, let's say you try some intervention where you're trying to, I don't know, let's say you're trying to improve people's mental arithmetic. And let's say you try and improve their working memory for memorizing numbers, giving strings of numbers, and then you'll get them to train their working memory for numbers, and you hope that that will improve their mental arithmetic. Well, let's say it doesn't. So how much you're very good at recalling numbers, it doesn't improve how well you do sums in your head. What you might do at that stage is do some brain imaging and find out that the areas of the brain activated when you're doing recalling of numbers, memorization of numbers, actually don't overlap with the regions of the brain when you're doing mental arithmetic. And that might be a clue that what you thought your cognitive theory was, that working memory for numbers might be important in mental arithmetic, maybe your cognitive theory is wrong. So in that case, your brain imaging evidence might help you to revise your cognitive theory. So at least that's the sense that I get about how one might want cognitive theory and brain-based data to interact, at least compared to this kind of simple correlation. But Dorothy Bishop goes a little further. She says teachers shouldn't go talking to neuroscientists. The neuroscientists should be locked in their laboratories. The teachers, if they're going to talk to anyone, should be talking to psychologists. Okay, so how might one respond to that? So one reason one might think that is that maybe you think neuroscience and education are too far apart. The disciplines are too remote. So maybe you might think, well, neuroscientists can't tell teachers how to plan their lessons. Right? They're measuring neural activity. Well, I'm not sure that's a good argument in itself about why disciplines shouldn't interact. So physicists, they can't build bridges. That doesn't mean physics isn't relevant for building bridges. Biochemists can't cure people. That doesn't mean biochemistry isn't relevant to medicine. It's more about how you find pathways to interleave between remote levels of discipline. So I'm going to go a bit further than that and say the problem here is that if teachers do just interact with psychologists, really there's some problems with psychology at the moment that might lead the teachers astray. So the problem here is that neuroscience should have been influencing psychology more. So really we want neuroscience to influence psychology, and then the educators can talk to the psychologists. To cut to the chase, I'm going to argue in the next few slides that the problem is that educators still mainly view the mind as if it were a desktop computer. And I'm going to argue for a range of reasons that that's not how it works. Okay. But first I want to show you 5 signs of trouble that something's wrong with modern psychology. And I thought, I went back to my hotel room and I thought there are some philosophers of science here, so I should try and be clear on what I mean by trouble. So here we go. This is the Ptolemaic model of the movement of heavenly bodies. They used to have a theory about how you can explain the movement of the planets and the sun in the sky. And of course it assumed that Earth is at the center. And the sun goes around the Earth, and that's fine. But if you look at the pathway of Mars across the sky, well, it goes around okay, but then it seems to go backwards. Well, that's because your basic assumptions are wrong, and luckily Copernicus came along and said, well, really, we're all going around the sun, the Earth is the center of the universe, and if you do that, then you get nice, simple pictures. Okay, so when I say there are some troubles with psychological theory, what I'm referring to is this bit here, the bit where it goes backwards. But it's worth bearing in mind that that model completely explains the data. And what's wrong with it is the bits in it that seem ad hoc or weird. Alright, so 5 signs of trouble in psychological theory, at least from the perspective of educational neuroscience. First of all, education is a lot about training and predicting the outcomes of training. And it seems to be the case also in interventions for developmental disorders that we are perpetually surprised that training doesn't have what's called far transfer. That training doesn't generalize to very distant abilities. So if you train on a working memory intervention, say for visual spatial skills, it doesn't improve working memory in general, it just improves visual spatial working memory. It doesn't improve, say, working memory for phonology, for instance. The question here is why we're perpetually surprised that we only get near transfer. And the answer to that is very probably our theories to begin with are just generating our intuitions about how far training effects should generalize. Secondly, when we're trying to match our cognitive theory to brain activations, the regions of the brain seem to work harder when we're doing a particular cognitive task, the mapping seems to be really difficult. There seem to be too many many-to-one and one-to-many relationships. So in one-to-many, so if these are brain regions, you find for a single cognitive task, there seem to be several brain regions that are activated. And if you take a given brain region, it seems to be involved in several cognitive tasks. So that's a real mess. Now that could just be a very complicated implementation, but it could also suggest that maybe our psychological theory isn't right. Now I'm going to come back to that particular point and go into it in more detail in a second. So here are some other points. The next one I've already alluded to, but it's kind of strange that emotion is peripheral to most cognitive theories. It seems to be studied mainly as an influence operating on attention, despite the fact that emotion has a primary adaptive role for memory. Why is it left to the side of most psychological theory? Next, cognitive theory doesn't explain certain things, say why the plasticity of the system should change with age, why you should be less able to learn things the older you get. It doesn't explain why we would forget. We have forgetting of certain memories, certain skills, but not others. And then we have these phenomena that just seem surprising given current cognitive theory. You just have to add on arbitrary ad hoc bits of theory to explain them. So things like embodiment seems to be attacked. I know some people claim that embodiment is so important that you can get rid of your theory of representation. It's a little bit strong. But embodiment seems to be tacked on in some sense to the basic psychological theory. Things like the role of sleep. Why should sleep be important? Why would you need to sleep? In my computer, well, I actually just go to sleep, but in a different way. This doesn't have to rest at night in order to function. And things like the effect of meditation. Why should sitting still and concentrating on your breath have any effect on cognition whatsoever? So these just seem surprising aspects given current cognitive theory. Okay, so I said I'd go into a little more detail on the relationship between cognitive theory and the brain. And I want to refer to, I think, a very interesting paper by Kathy Price and Friston, who we learned about in the previous talk. We talked about functional ontologies for cognition. And they really focused on how we might systematically try and map between the function of the brain as manifested in behavior and its structure as revealed by neuroanatomy. So I'll just read one sentence from the abstract. They say, they point to the problem that there is a high degree of overlap among the neural systems activated by tasks that share no cognitive components. This suggests that a given neuronal structure can perform multiple functions that depend on the areas with which it's connected. Now that fills me with concern that the mapping between cognition and the brain is going to be deeply mysterious. So what is it that brain regions actually do if they can appear to become involved in very different cognitive tasks? So Price and Friston used one particular example, particularly that Kathy Price has done a lot of research in. And this is looking at the conditions that make a particular brain region more active. So this is the left posterior lateral fusiform area. Different researchers have different names for it. Some of them call it the visual word form area, for example. So this is a diagram that summarizes the conditions where this part of the brain, which is kind of near the visual cortex, it's at the back and the ventral stream at the back and the underneath on the left. These are the stimuli, and this is the task you'll be doing. And that region becomes more active if you're naming words. So the output is a spoken word, but the input is a picturable word. It also becomes more active if you've got word objects that you're reading brain and naming the words. So doesn't have to be such as auditory input, say visual words, auditory words, braille words. But also this region, if you show pictures of objects and you have to do a hand action, so a picture of a toothbrush and you have to do a kind of brushing motion, it also becomes more active then. It seems to become more active if you've got pictures of animals than pictures of tools. So these seem quite disparate sorts of visual input from different modalities, and these seem different kind of outputs. So what does this brain region do? So Friston and Fry said, well, one of the problems here may be that what we're trying to do is relate these different structural decompositions to each other at different levels. So this is what they refer to as ontologies. And this would be their cognitive level, where you might say you do your task analysis and you integrate some data from double associations that you can see in after brain damage. And you say, well, we've got a region of the system, a cognitive system that processes words, maybe on animal structures and tools, faces, and so forth. And what we're looking at here is the different brain regions. This is roughly the visual stream from low-level visual input up the hierarchy. And this is this lateral posterior fusiform area. And our problem is that it seems to become more active, this one area, to two different components in our cognitive ontology. And Price and Friston said, well, maybe the problem here is that this kind of task decomposition we've done at the cognitive level, maybe that's wrong. Maybe we're not really at a cognitive level using the right primitives consistent with how the brain is actually doing its processing. And instead they argue that, well, maybe you want to argue that this component really is not about particular semantic categories, but about a general process of sensory-motor integration. Certain sensory inputs, they can be from different modalities, integrating with motor outputs, whether it's speaking or whether it's doing hand action. And if we were to reformulate our cognitive ontology using the primitives of brain function, then maybe it might become easier to have more direct one-to-one mappings between these levels of description. So I have to say this still doesn't enlighten me massively, sensory motor integration, about what that brain region is doing. This paper was published 10 years ago, so there is a more recent paper for those who are interested by Thomas Hannigan, Amici, and colleagues. And in their paper, this is in Trends in Cognitive Sciences, they're going further in trying to speculate about what might be going on in this brain region. In particular, that they widen it out to thinking about areas of sensitive to symbolic processing, so visual word form area, but there's also a nearby region that responds to numerical symbols. And they've got two hypotheses they talk about, that what's going on in that region may be defined by particular patterns of connectivity. So probably pre-existing connectivity before literacy and numeracy comes along, where the visual area may be connected to temporal regions, because the brain is expected through evolution for visual input of seeing people's mouths to be relevant to comprehending speech. And maybe there are connections between that visual area and parietal areas for body perception relevant to action, to do with actions that you do in response to perceiving other people's bodies. And that connectivity may interact with exposure to an educational format to produce specialization for visual word forms and number symbols. That's one hypothesis they pursue. The other hypothesis they pursue is in that region it has particular neurocomputational properties that make it good for perceiving three-dimensional geometric objects, which are insensitive to translation of variance. And that information can come from any modality, but it is the representation of objects that's going to be relevant to motor skill. So these are sort of progress in trying to understand what the brain's language might be and how that might correspond to cognitive ontology. Okay, so I'm going to do a little bit about metaphors now, and I'm going to argue mainly for educators, educational psychologists, that one of the difficulties is that individuals are using the wrong metaphor for how the mind works, presumably by implementation, how the brain works. I think this is less so in developmental cognitive neuroscience, where individuals are actually working with brain data, where I think the metaphors are changing. So let's be clear what I mean by the metaphor of a traditional computer and how that corresponds to the mind. So this is a children's book I got in the 1970s that explains how a computer works. Very informative. This is what a computer looked like in the 1970s. All of this now fits inside your mobile phone, including the woman who you interact with when you talk with, that's inside. The main point here is that, so I'm quoting from it, that the central processor, in here, central processor, control unit, the central processor is the part of the computer that does all the calculating. Okay, so it is intrinsically domain general. It does all the computations for whatever type of information you give to it. Now, this is one, interpreting that as a metaphor for how the mind works. There's a long tradition of appealing to technological metaphors of mind. It goes back hundreds of years. We're going to be ropes and pulleys, and then we were steam engines from a Freudian perspective, and then we were telephone network, and holograms, and symbolic computer. Now, the internet is the metaphor for how the mind works, obviously network theory. If you think about the 1980s computer for a metaphor of mind, what kind of theory is compatible with that for the way that mind works? What are the implementation constraints generated by one of these types of machines? Well, broadly they are as follows. The system is equally able to process any content that has the same abstract structure. Abstraction is really easy. In fact, it's too easy. We have the problem that we can't see how symbolic computational properties can be embodied. A simple grounding problem. It is driven by domain general mechanisms. So a central processing unit, what in English one would call a jack of all trades. Movement of information is really easy. So you have it on the hard disk, and it goes into working memory, and you do computations, and then it goes back and forth and back and forth. Indeed, the power of your computer is often constrained by the speed of the movement of information. Speed isn't everything. If I buy a new computer but install the same software, it won't be any cleverer. I need better software to make it clever. So those are those constraints then influence your cognitive theory. And there it is, there's a diagram, there's a CPU, working memory, long-term memory, lots of movement of information between those components, and all the calculation will be done in the central processing unit. So how could one use that as a metaphor to correspond to the mind when you know the brain, it doesn't look like a chipboard, it doesn't have these kind of components? Well, the idea was championed by David Marr that you could have split different levels of description, a computational level where you talk about what the system does, an algorithmic level where you work out how it does it, and then this separate implementation level where you figure out how the software is actually implemented on the machine, as it were. And this was used to argue that these levels can be studied independently. Job of psychologists, figure out what the software is. It's the guy studying brains who can figure out the implementation. So that was quite a while ago, so this was the 1980s, and increasingly with the emergence of cognitive neuroscience, there have been arguments that really, although you can study these things independently, they are not independent. The type of software that the brain is running will really be constrained by what it's easy to do in the structure that the brain provides. So this is a book, it's in red text, on C, that says Neuroconstructivism, that I published with some colleagues in 2007, which is really an attempt to take, in that case, cognitive developmental theory, which is the Piagetian theory, and try and make it more consistent with what is now understood about the development of brain function, functional brain development. And here the argument is that really you need consistency between levels of description. And that should go all the way from behavior through cognition, neurocomputation, biology, and genetics. All of these should be readily speak to each other. Okay, so the job then is to try and identify what the brain's implementation constraints are. We've seen what they are for a desktop computer. What are the implementation constraints of the brain? What's it going to be easy and hard to do in the brain? So I've been jotting these implementation constraints down on bits of paper, and you'll be glad to know that so far I've come up with 21 constraints in the brain. But I'm just going to focus on a couple of them to try and run through the arguments about what implementation constraints mean for cognitive theory. Okay, so I'm going to take the constraints that knowledge is part of the structure and it can't easily be moved, in contrast to a symbolic computer, that there are no general purpose mechanisms in the brain. There may be modulatory systems, but not systems that can process any kind of content. The working memory is content specific and multiple, it's not a general mechanism. And sleep is required to consolidate memories and maintain function. Okay, so let's have a look at how this example works. This is the idea that in real neural networks, process and knowledge are combined. So simple Hebbian learning says when the activation of two neurons is correlated, you tend to strengthen the connection between them. So what you're doing is building knowledge actually into the structure of the system. The strength of that connection can not then be passed all the way through the system. Your knowledge is built into the structure of your system. Okay, so what does that mean, that simple implementation constraint? This was the traditional computational theory in mind. This is going to be the revised version. What we have is domain-specific systems. And these domain-specific systems will combine working memory, CPU, central processing unit, and long-term memory. It's all going on in active systems which also store the long-term memory that process separate content for different domains, be it auditory, visual, motor, and so forth. So this is an active processing system. Roughly, this is going to correspond to posterior cortex, back of the brain. What you then have at the front of the brain is a modulatory system that says, given context and given my current goals, which part of this potentially active system should be relevant to deliver what I want to do. Okay? The modulatory system, unlike a CPU, doesn't have its own content. It's not like you're shipping information back and forth. You're using information here to inhibit certain regions here and activate others to deliver the task. Now that modulatory system is continually being influenced by goals. But roughly it's just a big system. So that influences which part, even given the context you're in, what parts of your active processing system should be engaged. So I've also put episodic memory. This is a separate system. This is going to be in the medial temporal lobes for those who are interested. This is storing kind of one shot all your experiences throughout the day. Now, as a mark in the brain of how hard it is to move information, how do we get information from the episodic memory system into conceptual memory? Here's what you have to do. You have to go to bed for 8 hours, turn off the entire system, reactivate this, and gradually update this as you blow through random information from episodic memory into long-term memory. That's how hard it is to move information in the system. Not because that's the best way to do it, but because that's an implementation constraint, which has been inherited from evolution. Okay, so I did try and put on a single slide how the brain works, and maybe that's a bit ambitious. But there's a few things I want to emphasize that are sometimes lost in the traditional cognitive view. The main point of having a brain is movement. Organisms that don't move don't need centralized brains to coordinate perception and action. So the evolutionary reasons about why you have a brain is to coordinate movement. To see, you have goals, you do movement as a response. The preferred code of the brain is sensory motor. It does not readily do abstraction. It's very good at computing higher order invariances in patterns, different sort of abstraction, but it doesn't do the kind of abstraction that you see in a symbolic computer. Doesn't mean it can't do it, it means it's reluctant to do it. You just have to send the system to school for 15 years to get it to be good at abstraction. Knowledge is stored in the structure of connections in domain-specific systems. The function is delivered by activation of context and goal-relevant domain-specific structures. Learning is delivered by emotional goal-mediated plasticity, which is an experience-dependent process. Its real-time dynamics are delivered by a process of competition and inhibition. And in order to do sophisticated cognitive skills, we tend to have to deliver those via interaction with external cultural information tools of the form of extended supersized mind and detailed emotion. Okay, so conclusion on floor one. In order to iron out theoretical problems that remain in psychology, we're going to have to revise psychology to be more consistent with how the brain operates. Now, I'm not claiming that this is about reductionism, that a better psychological theory is a brain theory. This is about taking primitives that are consistent with brain function and using those to constrain psychological theory. So it's the idea of consistency between laws and description. So I'm going to, I've only got 10 minutes left, talk a little less about the second floor. The second floor, I think, is less deep, but more pragmatic. And it's more to do with a history of a division of labour within psychology to study different forms of variability. So, variability, as I indicated, is spread across separate fields, and in many cases, you'll have different researchers studying intelligence and developmental disorders. And it sometimes takes researchers to stand up and say, no, development is relevant to developmental disorders, as we heard earlier today. Okay, so it's the World Athletics Championships at the moment. Usain Bolt just beat Justin Gatlin in 100 meters. So I'm going to use that metaphor to try and get across the idea of what I think the problem is. So let me see, that's going to be Usain Bolt, and that's going to be Justin Gatlin, and this is the 100 meters race. And they're off. They're running, and Usain Bolt comes through. This guy's been taking steroids. It's not fair. Okay, so if we were in psychology and we were trying to understand about that race, what we would do is we'd have two separate groups of people. One group, which we call the developmentalists, they'd average together all the runs until they've only got one run, it's the average of all the runs. And then we'd study the mechanisms by which the average runner gets from the start to the finish. And we come up with a theory about needing legs, arms, muscles, propulsion, balance, and so on. Another group of guys would take a cross-section of the race and they try and explain why some people are in front and some people are behind. And they come up with different types of theory. They say, well, it's what to do with training, whether you take steroids or not. And that explains our individual differences. Now these guys can think, well, I'm not doing development. What we'll do is we'll come back to the race a bit later and see how stable the individual differences are. Who's moved forward and who's moved back. But what you end up with is, surely you want an integrated theory that explains how mechanisms of individual differences operate through what you might call species universal mechanisms, things that don't vary. So that's the nub of what I'd argue is the problem of the division of labour. It is obviously hard to have large-scale longitudinal studies where you simultaneously investigate individual differences and development. So what could go wrong with that? I had a few examples. These are kind of recent findings and recent kind of arguments. So here's one of them: language growth doesn't seem to be influenced by environmental variation. How quickly children's vocabulary develops or their grammar ability. So you might conclude from that language development is mainly a maturational process, kind of the unfolding of an internal program, of a nativist event. It's the second one. Intelligence scores are highly heritable. Now that means genetic, which suggests little environmental influence on your intelligence. On the other hand, IQ scores seem to have increased by about 10 to 15 IQ points each generation in the 20th century. Now, presumably that's because the education is better and nutrition is better and these other things. But that suggests that there's a large environmental influence on intelligence. That seems to be a bit paradoxical. Is the environment important or is it not important? Here's another example. The heritability of intelligence, interestingly, rises later in development for high ability individuals than low. So the heritability of intelligence goes up with age, but that happens earlier in development, indeed in adolescence, in lower ability individuals and higher ability individuals. You might conclude from that intelligence is an extended sensitive period in brain development. Your brain goes on being sensitive to environmental input, variations in environmental input for longer in development. Here's the final one. Intelligence seems to be highly heritable. It's got this kind of strong genetic influence. And you might think that's consistent with intelligence being a specific adaptation of Homo sapiens amongst the primates. We've got bigger brains, right? So we're intelligent, it's an evolutionary adaptation. So let's park those just for 1 minute. So I've indicated that it is hard to study individual differences in development at the same time, because what you need is to do longitudinal studies of cohorts, okay, which means collecting an awful lot of data, a long time to collect that data. One of the complementary methods you can use to investigate this issue is computational modeling. So what you can do is you can use, say, an artificial neural network. So this is like a real neural network but simplified, so you've just got simple processing units and connections, and you model the development of an ability. And what happens is you randomize the connections to begin with, and then you expose the network to a structured learning environment, and through interaction with that structured learning environment, eventually you generate behavior. And at the same time, you can have a look at how the structure is changing in there, and view that in some senses as analogous to changes in brain structure, like grey matter and white matter. Interestingly, in these networks, certain properties of the networks make them better or worse at learning. So, take the number of connections or the number of units inside. So, you can put variations into these models that make them better or worse at learning. And indeed, you can generate large populations of these models that have different abilities to learn. And one of the things I've done over the last 5 years is to say, well, let's add another level of description here. Let's have an artificial genome where we can encode variations in learning ability on a genome. And then what we're going to do is we're going to have variation in the learning abilities of the networks. And let's say that's mainly from genetic origin. But also we're going to put variation in how good stimulation is coming from the environment. So you get two sources of variation. What you get is a normal distribution of performance that changes across development. So in this situation, you can now study individual differences in a developmental framework. And indeed, because you can encode the similarity between networks in a genome, you can simulate identical twins or non-identical twins. And therefore, you can try and investigate changes in heritability. So a particular set of twins happens to be my own. I couldn't think of any model, but I put a picture there. Okay, so this is an example of some simulated data. This is showing developmental trajectories across development, how well you're doing on the task. And this is showing that you get this vast set of different developmental trajectories, which are generated in part from differences in learning ability, and in part from differences in the environment. Now, it's true that you could average all of these, and you get that trajectory. That would be some other study development. Or you could just take cross-sections and look at the distribution, how many individuals are at different points. And you could study individual differences in that way. But ultimately, it becomes apparent when you're doing this that individual differences are simply modulations of developmental trajectories. And to understand individual differences or even developmental disorders, you need to do so with reference to the operation of developmental mechanisms. So, it turns out all of these issues, which I've modeled within this framework, turn out to be wrong. Either the necessity of these inferences or the fact that these are paradoxes. Now, I don't have any time left, so we're going to go to my conclusion. So we've got 3 minutes. If you're interested, we can pick one of these examples and I can show you how it works out. Any votes for any of these examples you'd be interested in? It's whoever shouts loudest. Thank you. Intelligence, 3 of them are on intelligence.
The second.
Second one, okay. So this is called the Flynn effect. Let's see if I can go to this one. It's called the Flynn effect. So, studied by a guy called Flynn, who first observed it. These are the empirical data. So this is measuring intelligence scores across a bunch of different intelligence tests and recording the gain in the mean population attributes, the mean population score on these tests across decades. It differs across the test, but broadly it demonstrates that over the decades there have been IQ gains of up to 25 to 30 IQ points. Whereas the heritability, which is being assessed by the difference in the correlation of intelligence between identical twins and non-identical twins, that appears highly heritable. I've seen estimates from 60 to 80%. So how do we reconcile these? Well, once you're considering things within a population framework, it begins to become apparent that individual differences in development need to be viewed separately. So let's say we've got some test score, and this is the distribution of performance of the population. So this will be the mean performance here. At the moment, let's say we've normed it to 0. Let's say these are individuals within the population, and this is their rank order. Okay, now let's say I improve the environment for everyone. I make everyone's nutrition better, I send everyone to better schools. What happens is the whole population, and the whole population, and the whole population, and the whole population. You can have factors that are affecting everyone that moves the mean of the whole population, but the individual differences within there may remain exactly the same. And the individual differences may have an entirely different cause. So people may be at the bottom or the top for genetic reasons. And that they may remain the same even when you move the whole population up. So that's why it's not a paradox indeed to try and study this systematically. You need to try and work out what the relationship is between the factors affecting individual differences and the factors affecting mean population levels. Now, they won't be completely independent because depending on whether the whole environment is really bad or the whole environment is really good, different properties become limiting factors on individual differences. That is, I may be genetically brilliant, but if I'm in an awful environment, I'm not going to do very well. But if the environment's great and I'm genetically great, I'm probably going to do better than someone who's genetically poor. So this is a set of simulations where the environment was given a fixed range. So if this is your index of environmental quality going from 0 to 1, 1 to 10 here, you raise the same population either in environments that vary between, say, 6 to 10, or you take the same genetic population, and now you raise them in an environment where it goes from 5 to 9. And you can progressively simulate populations that are raised in poorer and poorer environments. Now, the range of genetic variation and the range of environmental variation are identical. What you find is, so this is a measure of heritability, and this is the population mean performance, that I'm looking at two different types of population depending on whether there's big variation in genetic ability or small variation, that you do find regions where you can vary the quality of the environment and there's not much change in heritability. It's at a lower level for a population where there's not much genetic variation. So the point is here, I'm not saying this is the correct answer, I'm just saying to address these questions, you need to have mechanistic systems that simultaneously address developmental mechanisms and the causes of individual differences. That was the take. So I should go back to the general conclusions just to wrap up. So conclusions on this second floor. Studying variation in large longitudinal populations is hard. We all know it's hard. It's easy to do cross sections. But you can, although you can study these forms of variability separately, it doesn't mean they are separate. So you need to understand mechanisms at a population level in terms of variation in lifespan trajectories. And I've argued here that computational modeling is one method that can allow you to focus on the relevant mechanisms. Overall conclusion, I'm not saying modern psychology isn't great. It is good. But cognitive psychology needs to be reformed in some areas by brain science. I'm not arguing for reductionism, I'm arguing for consistency. And the separate studies of varieties of variation need to be unified with respect to the understanding of common mechanisms and computational methods, as well as large cohort longitudinal studies are types of methods that are going to be helpful there. I have a bunch of people to thank who have contributed to these work, my collaborators and funders, and many thanks for your
I have a few comments. I just have to say, first of all, that I pretty much admire Thomas' work, so it's difficult. Because instead of feeling disappointed, I feel inspired. Well, the first was, as according to you, the flaws are response insufficient influence of psychology of neuroscience on psychology, and integrating psychology, neuroscience, artificial intelligence, and so on is something we have to pursue. And the second one is that studies on variations in cognitive ability are done separately, leading to conceptual confusion. So I want to focus in this kind of examples which are recurring in cognitive science, where, for example, you always focus in these cases where in the correlation between the brain activation and the cognitive task. So you have this kind of cases where you have this kind of association. What I think is that your points are mainly right about this, and I just want to focus in the first place in these ones. You think that educational neuroscience attempts to use insights from neural mechanisms of learning for education, and that psychology in fact is in several ways not very fit at the moment. So the main question of your first flaw is how can we put psychology in a better shape? So my first comment is that about these things of the overlapping areas and the cognitive theory need to be changed. It might be that this distinction, the old distinctions of Chomsky between the competence and performance, if you think that it would be of some help to psychology, in the sense that, well, the distinction claims that you can in one side have or being focused in the structure and cognitive mechanisms which allows to account for specific cognitive processes, and in the other hand you can focus separately on the contextual conditions in which the tasks are performed. So this is another way to say that if you think it could be again useful to reintroduce those critics where you have to be very aware of the logic of the subtraction method, where you have an ideal capacity, an ideal case, and if you really subtract the performance mistakes, just say that it is all perfectly working and you have just one problem in that scenario, so you can subtract the cognitive impairment. I think you have a lot of work on that, but it seems that when we are thinking again in the general landscape, we can be missing those points again. And also that thing or that critic on residual normality, where you think that you can have purely intact task, and on the other hand you can subtract it in the same case. And as in these ideal dissociations where you can claim that you can make an analysis of a first group, they have one group, and you notice that they can perform almost perfectly at a cognitive task TA, but they have major problems or noticeable problems when you look in the second one, the cognitive phase. And the opposite case, when they have problems, and when the second group has problems with the first task, and they have no major problems with the second one. So again, that would be another way to say that we can be, psychology could be in a very shape when considering again those kind of critics where you cannot have an ideal dissociations even when you design the experiment. It might be that you might be focusing just in one small part of the first task, which is not part of the intersection, but when they are, if you see in the big landscape, you can see that they are not separated, and that most of the time it happens something like this when you have a cognitive task, which is part of a broader, major, more complex cognitive task. But you're only focusing in a separated area, or just when you try to identify phases and you're just looking at the tracking of the eye, then you can be missing the big picture of it. As in these cases, when, as you mentioned, you have no independence in general. So it could be a good idea again to rethink again these arbitrary partitions when you're assessing cognitive functions, which if you see them as ideal cases, then there might be implausible, and also that in general the idea of functional independence is elusive. So that would be the second one. A third comment would be to ask you, what do you think about this idea? To what extent psychology, neuroscience, artificial intelligence, educational improvements via neuroscience are stuck in old biology? I mean, that it might not be just a problem of psychology, but it's a huge inheritance where you have something like this. It's the old idea of causality coming from biology, from a single cause, where, for example, you have Vibrio cholera causing cholera, Treponema pallidum causing syphilis, or something like that. And then you start again your experimental design with such ideas in your mind. So, which implies anatomistic logic of a single agent causing an infection, causing a disease, causing a disability, a cognitive impairment, and where theory goes along. So it might be the case that you're very much influenced by those atomistic logic. And it goes from biology to scientific medicine to neuroscience and psychology in general. So that might be a cause of the first flow too. Now about the second part of your talk. Your proposal mainly is that we can, or you use or multi-scale computational modeling, and you mentioned it turns out as an alarm to me that you say it comes in this article you wrote in this year, that you say that it originally comes, that it is inspired in systems biology, and that the aim of multi-scale models is to integrate relevant information at multiple levels, as in this scheme you provided to us. So the main features of these proposals, as I see it, is that rightly, if you treat individual differences and populations as separated domains, then you can get easily confused, and the study of the forms of variability separatedly when in fact they are not separated. So the question about this second part could be, which would be the limits of modeling, as in the case or the inspirations of systems biology, which is mainly based, systems biology is based in gene modeling. But the problem is that this kind of biology is reductionistic and that pays little attention to interaction between components. And also all those critics coming from, for example, Cornish, where they say that we don't have reliable methods for undertaking all of the steps involved in deducting a phenotype from them, that few genetic variants could account for a lot of diseases, and what is most important, or what I think is crucial, is that the concept of organism in biology have disappeared as a fundamental exploratory concept in biology. And when we see some models like based on systems biology, then we could try to say that it will have the same luck. And because as this guy put it, as long as an organism is treated as no more than a collection of components and you design a simulation to predict their behavior, one cannot ask the right question, and certainly we cannot answer them. We cannot answer to those questions. So would you think that it would be also valuable for psychology that the organism is taking its main role back, because if you're focusing on the organisms, then you could explore much more possibilities. You can have clearer dynamics, and you can take into consideration that such issues as that organisms are constructing their ranges. So that would be a way to put back the integration, regulation, and organization you are trying to recover also in your proposal. And finally, what do you think about some specific multi-scales models? Because you say that you quote the work from Sauter on the dynamic approach of ion channels and on carpet modeling, and it's very, I don't know, it's surprising that, for example, when another guy is trying to do something similar, for example, novel, he confessed that even with those simulations, the tools we used to deal with causation, with further development, mathematics, and even changing our logic of thought, because we cannot predict all functions, they say, and he even claims that it is ignorance of all those forms of downward causation that is impeding us progress. So, in the end, this would be the main point. That pursuing theoretical and conceptual approaches to grapple with complexity in cognitive science. And something very ironical is that when modeling, although incorporating several elements, at the same time we cannot see the big picture. We're not capturing the dynamicism, which you have been worked a lot through the years. So that's ironic, because when you put it that way, then we cannot appreciate that dynamicism of your proposal. So how could we go back from that artificial neural modeling to conceptual debates on development? That would be it.
So you have about 5 minutes to try to answer. And then we open the question from the audience.
So, thank you, Paola. It's intriguing and fascinating thoughts that I don't think I can answer all of them straight away. I have to think about some of them. Competence and performance. I'm still worried about those from the Chomsky hangover. I'm going to struggle to detoxify those notions, which from my perspective seem to be mechanisms of defense to ignore certain sorts of empirical evidence that seem to falsify theory. But I do appreciate the notion of trying to distinguish between capability and how it's expressed in the moment. I think there are some senses that in the way that the brain does things is a mess. It does things in whatever way is to hand that it can get things done. So in the neuroconstructivism book, we argued for the idea of partial representations, that what we would normally take, say philosophically as a concept, is actually distributed in multiple brain areas. And when you are in situations that would seem to involve that concept, maybe context only causes you to activate parts of the representation. So when as a cup, I have a concept of cup and its properties and what it does and so forth. But when I reach for it, I may only activate aspects to do with its geometry and how I grasp it, so my pincer grip. But do I want some more coffee? You ask me a question, I see whether it's full or not, and I think about, am I thirsty and so forth. So the same concept, viewed objectively, may or may not come into play given what parts of the information are activated, as I talked about, by context and by goals. Where it gets even messier is the brain may have multiple ways to deliver the same behavior, which may have differing levels of abstraction about them. So this is work, in fact, that Kathy Price has pursued quite a lot about the notion from biology called degeneracy. So different structures being able to generate the same function. And this came out of partly out of her work looking at individuals who had suffered brain damage. So you can, let's say you're doing a semantic task, you get some pictures and you're showing some pictures and you have to say whether they're animals or tools. You just press one button or another. And you can do brain imaging and you can see that there's a group of 20 people, what brain regions light up when they do that task, and you can have like half a dozen regions. And then you can look at a set of patients who've had strokes, and you can see in those individuals which brain areas have been damaged. And I think I was at a talk where Kathy Price put up like 15 of these images of big lesions overlying these different networks that seem to be involved in making these semantic decisions. And then at the end of it, she said, all of these individuals performed in the normal range on the semantic categorization task. And given she was funded by a grant to locate, to get correspondences between images of lesions and how they would predict behavioral deficits, that's a bit of a problem for her. But it led her to speculate that actually the problem here was averaging across individuals. That the parts of the brain that were being activated were not necessary components, but some of them were sufficient. And it may be that different individuals would do this task by activating different subsets of the network. It's only when you group average that you get the kind of combination of all the areas. And that's why the lesions that took out some of the areas, they wouldn't impair you if you were the type of individual who was delivering that task using another combination. So this is one of the reasons why just using our standard necessary and sufficient logic and double dissociation, it kind of comes a cropper when the possibility is the brain has multiple ways to do things, and those multiple ways may be different between individuals or amenable to strategic change in the moment. I do like your reference to the old biology and its kind of linear causality and so forth. I do appreciate your comments about the risk of taking out the dynamism. development of interactions with the environment and with conspecifics. I think this is a major problem in educational neuroscience, that you risk focusing on the individual when many educational phenomena are group-based phenomena, classroom phenomena, and they involve interactions between teacher and pupil. And we have to find ways to integrate neuroscience and to inform how those kind of interactions take place. There are computational methods that focus more on the dynamics and formal mathematical approaches of dynamical systems. They sometimes simplify away from the structure of the task to focus on temporal dynamics, whereas the type of model I was using, actually it models the acquisition of specific behaviors from an area of language development, and I've used that model to capture the effects of socioeconomic status on language development, for instance, simulating real empirical data. Down to 1 minute, I'll just finish with a concern about that I have, or a confusion to do with the new biology. Assuming there was an old biology which is bad, there's a new biology which is good. And the new biology, it seems to be based around the medical model, and it talks in terms of probabilistic risk factors, probabilistic causality. That you have a certain number of gene variants, and the more gene variants you have a certain form, it increases your risk of showing certain kinds of phenotypes or certain kind of diseases and so forth. I feel really uncomfortable with the notion of probabilistic causality. I mean, causality is like a billiard ball, one hits the other, right? In my mind, a very, very simple thinker. And I don't like the idea that the billiard ball comes along and then someone throws a dice and decides whether the other billiard ball is going to move. So what is this notion of probabilistic cause that seems a necessary part of the modern new biological explanation of the relationship between genes to structure and structure to behavior? For me, a probabilistic relationship means you're missing some subset of the causal factors. As I understand causality, it's only probabilistic if you're at the quantum level. And Einstein didn't even like that. So, but we're at the macro level. So saying that you've got a probabilistic relationship between cause and effect, to me is simply redescribing statistical data and calling it an explanation. I think you need to have more mechanistic explanations that have more of the factors, however complex they're supposed to be.
Thank you. So, questions?
I'll just read. So I have a question about certain tool, and I'm less impressed than you are by the Price and Fish 2005 argument for changing cognitive ontologies or functional ontologies. It strikes me the argument only works if you assume that we have a good understanding of the brain ontology. If we know what are the right brain parts, if we have the right brain parcellation. But we don't, as a matter of fact, and there's good reason to believe as soon as you change the way of parcellating the brain, you can discriminate between most cognitive constructs. This is nice paper by Podrak's team, Lenartovich and colleagues, that show that, provided you look at enough box sets, you're going to be able to discriminate most cognitive constructs in the domain of cognitive control. If you use MDPA, you can discriminate most emotional concepts. So, the argument just assumes, you need to look at the visual word form area, and then you have the multifunctionality and degeneracy. But if you change the brain ontology, then you can keep the cognitive ontology. So my question for you is, maybe psychology is not the issue. Maybe the issue is neuroscience. Right? We're not at the point where we can use neuroscience to tell psychology what to do.
Yeah, so like I said, to be fair to Price and Friston in that paper, they start off by saying there are methodological limitations of imaging. Part of the issue of is the same brain area doing more than one thing. is contingent on you having enough resolution to be able to determine that. And even that, you need to rule out the possibility that there are interleaved networks which are overlapping, so you can't spatially pull them apart. But from imaging, it looks like it's the same region doing different things. There are slightly more sophisticated methods that can use adaptation techniques. So these kind of, if you have the brain do a certain task and then make it do the task again, it would be slightly less active the second time around. And you can use that to see whether this kind of habituation effect generalizes across two tasks. And that helps you get around some of these issues of resolution. But I agree with you. I mean, you don't want to jump too quickly. I think this is part of a bigger picture that there are sufficient elements of current psychological theory that seem ad hoc or bizarre that suggest that you're going to have to change the cognitive ontology as well.
Questions?
And I think I really like the fact that you had a theory of the whole brain on one slide, especially nowadays when people are very specialized and we're really looking for a big picture story of the brain. One thing you replaced in that was that the information flow was very limited, it's just modulation now. And of course, another area that's important for education in which information processing and information theory has been applied is communication. So communication is thought of as the transfer of packets of meaning or content between heads. And that's something that maybe also needs to be revised. I wonder whether you could say something about that.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, that's certainly an area that needs greater focus. I think language can be, when you write it down on a piece of paper, it looks objective, like it has a single meaning. But I think one of the problems with that simple model of information transfer is the same words can be understood in different ways by different people depending on their prior experience. So some of the areas we're working in education, so we've just started a project where we're looking at the potential to improve primary age children's maths and science learning by training them in inhibitory control abilities, but specifically couched in the domain. So we're only going to have near transfer. But the insight there is, if you're going to learn things like maths, so how to deal with equations or geometry, part of that job is to inhibit irrelevant perceptual properties of the stimulus that you see. So in equations, it doesn't matter what the letters are, it's just the relationship between them. And in geometry, there are many aspects of how something is written down that are irrelevant to the abstract kind of proofs that you're going to derive. So to learn maths, you need to learn how to inhibit irrelevant perceptual information. When it comes to science, again, inhibition is important. There are imaging studies in expert scientists that show what they're expert at is inhibition, and it's the inhibition of your familiar knowledge of physical systems, your intuitive interaction with them every day. So part of learning about, say, the abstract aspects of physical systems is to be able to inhibit your intuitive interactions with them. So there's this interaction between what you say to someone and trying to put particular knowledge into them via the sentences you give them, but also making sure that the way they control their prior knowledge is compatible with their acquisition of new knowledge as well.
Yeah, so I would like to talk about the show. It was really interesting, blending together. I guess you must know that paper by Conferencia in 1975, so two disciplines of psychology, which is exactly your starting point, right? You've got individual variation, you have the average. Right? On the other hand, if you look at the history of physiology, for example, right, how did we come to understand what the heart does or what the liver does? I kind of wonder whether we would have made that much progress if we had done what you're suggesting to do right now. On the contrary, what people seem to have done is to abstract and to idealize away from individual variation. right? And by using abstractions and idealization, knowing full well there were abstractions and idealization, they were able to learn a lot about the physiology, right? So, I think that's actually really an exciting research project. But I kind of wonder when you look at the history of physiology, whether that's not exactly the other way that led us to make much progress in physiology.
So I think the second half was much more about the pragmatics. And when you draw the wrong conclusions or you get confused about taking inferences from one set of data and over applying them to another, these are not necessary things that you have to do as long as you were being disciplined and understanding the limitations of what you were studying. And it's part of this interaction, which is a much more pragmatic one about the way we ask questions, the way we collect data can sometimes influence the kind of conclusions that we draw, which are not necessary inferences, but we can lead ourselves astray in that way. So it's more an issue about the pragmatics of the way we're doing it than the necessity of the conclusion.
Well, there's time for a last question. I think it's mine. I'm able to say that the main role of the brain is movement. No? Maybe you can think about the primary function that is to get resources. And many times you don't need to move to get resources. So what happens if you have a primary function that is not moving, that is not moving, that is another function, or something like that.
So I think I'd like to make the point that in many cases I'm talking about constraints. So preferences about the way the system wants to work. So these are not ways that it has to work, but you can, by training, by discipline, by remorselessly exposing the brain to particular types of structured environments, you can make it do things which are not about movement. You can make it train itself to resist. I want to go get a beer now, but still I'm going to sit here and answer your question. I like to gesticulate when I'm talking because gesture is part of language, but I can sit here and say, I'm sitting at the table, I'm going to inhibit that, I'm just going to talk. So there are issues about what are the constraints in the system, about the things that it's built to do and therefore will do more easily, versus what is the plastic potential for the system for the outcomes it can potentially reach. So I think literacy and numeracy, which are very kind of abstract notions, these are, it's fascinating that we have no evolutionary specific structures in our brain that allows us to have numerate brains or literate brains, but we do have sufficient plasticity that put a kid through school for long enough that you can find dedicated brain structures that deal with numbers and that deal with words. But those wouldn't be ready to, the brain doesn't really want to deal with symbolic numbers. It wants to deal with real sensory motor magnitudes and whatnot, not abstract notions of 2-ness or 3-ness or 3 divided by 2-ness. But you can get there by systematic training.
Muchas gracias.